ladies and gentlemen, friends of Ukraine. I'm going to speak about three things today. A quick summary of what's happened, what has not happened, and what needs to happen. First, we're witnessing the unthinkable. A madman who controls the largest country in the world, the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and one of the biggest armies in the world, has invaded Ukraine without cause or justification. In the first days of the attack, he launched a blitzkrieg, a campaign of shock and awe, and it failed miserably. So he changed his tactics. Relative to how he started, but these are old tactics. When the Ukrainian people didn't greet him with open arms, singing and dancing, offering flowers and bread and salt, he thought, no, it's time to punish them. I'm going to bomb them into the Stone Age. But he's done this before. He did it in Chechnya, he did it in Aleppo in Syria, and he's doing it all across Ukraine right now. Nothing is being spared. Hospitals, schools, kindergartens, residential complexes, evacuation routes, safe corridors, and he's bombing those. He's using cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, Katyusha rockets, heavy artillery, and recently, cluster bombs. Cluster bombs are banned, by the way, in the world. They're illegal. It's a war crime to use them. They serve one purpose and one purpose alone. It's to kill people, and especially children, because when they land, they flutter down like little toys, and not all of them blow up. And when kids come by, they look like toys. They pick them up, and their hands get blown off, their heads get blown off, they're horribly maimed, or they're killed. And he's using those weapons in Ukraine today. He's also introduced and begun deploying thermobaric weapons, the worst weapons on the planet short of nuclear weapons. War crimes again. Why has he done this? Well, this is interesting. He's explained his purpose from the start. He's said so publicly to the Russian public, to the world, to anybody who would listen. These are his words, not mine. Ukrainian, that's not a language. Ukrainian people, that's not a nation. Ukraine, that's not a country. The Ukrainian state, that's an abstract, artificial construct, I quote, that has no right to exist. Well, what conclusion do we draw from these words? Well, like Stalin, he is trying to obliterate every trace of the Ukrainian identity and of its national autonomy. The civilized world calls that genocide, and if he succeeds, it will be the greatest genocide in human history. Why should the West help? Well, I can think of 5 reasons off the top. First, and this is the most obvious, we are witnessing a moral abomination. Isn't that enough reason to stop this? Second reason, we have seen this movie before. 1932-33, Stalin murdered millions of Ukrainians by starvation because they opposed collectivization. 10 years later, Hitler destroyed virtually all European Jews, and the West didn't help until it was too late, and they were annihilated. Third reason, 1994, Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. 1994, Ukraine handed off to Russia its entire nuclear stockpile, everything, third largest in the world at the time, in exchange for a promise, a commitment from Russia to protect and respect Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Well, Russia lied, as we could see. However, 2 other countries signed that memorandum, America and the United Kingdom, and they too promised to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. Where are they now? Fourth reason, Ukraine since independence, most people won't know this, Ukraine since independence is the only country in the world that has stood side by side in combat with its soldiers and American soldiers everywhere in the world. America has asked the international community for support. Ukraine alone has done this. And fifth reason, maybe our Canadians remember, maybe they forget. I'm sure the images of the evacuation of Kabul are still seared in the memories of most Canadians. Near the end, hundreds of thousands of people crowded the airport, and most of the armed forces of the countries of the West had left Afghanistan by this time. Only the Americans and a few UK soldiers left right on the fence at the airport. And what did Ukraine do? It sent in its special forces to rescue Afghan interpreters and their families that Canada had promised refuge to. And it saved them, and it saved Ukrainian citizens, and it saved a couple hundred citizens of other countries when everybody else had left. Let's not forget their courage helping other countries in the world now in their time of need. Part of the response we have seen from world governments is due not to the governments themselves, but to the people of the world themselves, starting with the Ukrainian diaspora. It may be 10 million, it may be as much as 15 million people around the world. But there have been demonstrations the last 10 days, not in dozens of cities, but hundreds of cities around the world in places you'd never imagine. Thailand, Japan, India, all over Southeast Asia, over 30 cities in Canada alone, all over America, every country of Europe, Africa, the Middle East, all over the world, people are pressuring their governments to help. And that pressure is working. And that pressure has brought about things like weapons and military supplies to Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's only things you can hold in your hands. Nothing big, nothing like planes, nothing like anti-aircraft defense systems, nothing like sophisticated radar to detect Russian missile batteries and artillery batteries. Things Ukraine, we're getting to that. We've had training missions. We've had economic sanctions. But by the way, this is something Canadians need to know. Our Prime Minister announced a few days ago that, yes, we're banning all crude oil imports from Russia. Here's a fact. We haven't actually imported crude oil from Russia for 3 years. However, we import over $500 million worth of refined petroleum products from Russia every year, and we haven't banned those yet. And neither has America, and neither has most of the rest of the world. What kind of sanctions are those? Every penny for those billions of dollars of sales goes to bombing Ukraine. Stop it. Ban those products. Stop the sale. Stop the murder in Ukraine. The rest of the world has opened its borders to refugees, in particular Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. We are eternally grateful to these countries. They are doing heroic work, and they deserve all the assistance we can provide them. And then we get to the symbolic stuff, which doesn't exactly help a lot, but we'll take what we can get. So we get a UN resolution condemning Russia. That's good. That doesn't stop bombs from falling. We've launched now war crimes investigations. This is good, but they take years. We have a lot of what we call moral support. Okay, that's great. Didn't stop the bombing that we saw here in Chernihiv, just on the screen. We have hand-wringing of every description. We have lamentations of how the Ukrainians are suffering. We have platitudes and encomiums to the bravery of the Ukrainian people. Those are all nice to hear. They're kind of inspiring, but they don't stop the bombs from falling on Ukraine. So what has not happened? Well, I just described to you. Not enough has been done by the West to stop the bombing. Russia continues to control, for the most part, the skies over Ukraine. And if NATO is not going to provide a no-fly zone, please provide Ukraine with what it needs to create its own no-fly zone. But let me interpret the words of the head of NATO, the words of our government and the American government and the governments of all the EU countries. This is an interpretation. I'm going to put to you in English what they are saying. First of all, as a prelude, I'm going to give you a basic truth. The only way to stop ongoing murder is by physical intervention. United Nations resolutions do not stop murder.
Russia controls Iran.
Economic sanctions do not stop murder. Condemnation does not stop murder. So where does that leave us? Well, at the moment, the West seems content to, like I say, offer lamentations, encomiums, moral support, while watching every night on TV, 24/7, watching Ukrainians be murdered by the Russian Federation. That's very uncomfortable, but still not ready to intervene. Here's something interesting. I've heard this now twice in the last 24 hours on TV. Our Western leaders, instead of drawing red lines that Russia must not cross, is drawing red lines for Ukraine that we won't cross. Like helping with a no-fly zone, among other things.
NATO needs to grow fair.
Thus far, not one single leader in the entire civilized world, not one, has answered the following question. How many Ukrainian civilians must be murdered before I will take concrete steps to stop the slaughter? Why is that? Why can't they answer that question? What's holding them back? I'll tell you what's holding them back. Nuclear blackmail by Putin. Okay, let's work through the logic of that. You have nukes, you can invade your neighbor anytime you want, to any extent you want. You've got nukes. That's the message we're sending to North Korea, to Iran, to any other country that wants to arm itself with nukes. Unless maybe your neighbor belongs to NATO, but we're not sure about that. So there's a problem with this logic. The West is saying it cannot help Ukraine because it would lead to war in the rest of Europe. However, if one single stray Russian bullet should hit one single innocent person in a NATO country, suddenly it's one for all and all for one, and we're off to war against Russia, and we don't care about no stinking nuclear blackmail. How does that work? So this is what we end up with. If you sign a piece of paper and join the NATO club, it's all good and fine. You can't be blackmailed by Putin. You fight back. But if you live next door, you share the same values, you fight for the same things, but you have not been allowed to sign the piece of paper to let you join the club, well, tough luck. I guess Ukrainian lives don't count as much as NATO lives or anybody else's lives. And let's think back to those famous words after the Holocaust. Never again. Well, it's happening again. And let's not sit on our hands again. We need tighter, harsher sanctions. We need sanctions on those petroleum products and everything else Russia sells to the West. It's not enough to sanction the yachts of oligarchs and the children of oligarchs that go to Harvard or Yale. Let's get serious with our sanctions. If NATO does not have the moral courage to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, for God's sake, give Ukraine what it needs to establish its own no-fly zone. There are other options, and thank God we're starting to see them. It turns out that one of the greatest weapons in Ukraine's possession are the Turkish Bayraktar drones. They are superb at destroying Russian military columns. Perhaps the West could arrange to purchase a lot more of these drones so that Ukraine can start hitting that 40-mile column north of Kyiv before it encircles the nation's capital and before Putin, in his own words, can decapitate the leadership of Ukraine's government. We had 141 countries sign the resolution, UN resolution condemning Putin. Can't we create a UN peacekeeping force? Can't we send in UN troops to stop the fighting on the ground? That's something else we should be considering. Last thing. We are witnessing the greatest human exodus of war refugees since the Second World War. If you are interested in supporting the people on the ground, supporting those refugees, I would ask you to consider making a donation to the Canada-Ukraine Foundation. Website cufoundation.ca. cufoundation.ca. And if you want to volunteer to help in any other way here in Canada, go to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress website, ucc.ca. ucc.ca. The first page you see when you click on that website is a line you fill in if you want to volunteer to help in any way here in Canada. I conclude with the following words. I find myself being more and more grateful every day for being a Canadian citizen. We live in one of the greatest countries on earth. Today I'm also prouder than I have ever been before of the people of Ukraine, as they engage in a life and death struggle against unspeakable evil, fighting to uphold the very values the West espouses and claims to live by. And yes, while the Ukrainian people are very much grateful for the material help and moral support they're receiving from the West, the tragic fact remains that on the ground and in the skies above Ukraine, they stand utterly alone against the Russian Goliath. Their unmatched courage, their unbreakable will, and quiet dignity will in time become a separate chapter in the history of the human spirit. Long live Ukraine, long live the Ukrainian people. Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava.